Hello everyone, we're just waiting for people to join us. We'll be starting in a moment. Hi to everyone who's just joining. We're just giving it a couple of minutes while people are still coming in. So we'll just wait a couple of minutes before Paul and Yosario start. You can still see there's just a couple more people joined. So welcome, we'll be starting in a minute or two. Okay. I wonder if you start, Paul. I think I haven't seen anybody join in the last few seconds, so maybe we'll start and people can catch up as they join us.
Okay, thanks, Pippa. Very warm welcome to all of you who've joined us. My name is Paul Grady. I'm the co-director of the Centre for Applied Human Rights. And the Centre currently also holds a UNESCO chair, which I'm currently the post holder for, which looks at trying to enhance the role that universities can play in protecting human rights defenders and activists at risk, and enhancing political space and protecting democratic freedoms. The UNESCO chair was launched in March 2023, so earlier this year in York, and we've since then embarked on a range of different projects. One of the projects, for example, is developing a set of guidelines for universities that want to host human rights defenders and activists at risk. A second project is the development of an Africa hub within the network. So the chair is supported by a global network of universities and kind of piloting the idea of a regional hub. Initially, that'll be hosted at the University of the Western Cape. And we had a very successful meeting in August setting out what that hub might look like. Thirdly, we're funding piloting some research projects at partner universities. So, for example, at the University of Buenos Aires, we have colleagues looking at the role of universities in political transitions. So in the transition from military rule to democracy in Argentina, what became possible for a university like the University of Buenos Aires in terms of human rights work, transitional justice work, and so on, in that window of opportunity, but then was it possible to defend those gains in the post-transition period? And finally, we're organizing a series of online events, of which this is the first, though it's a pilot and an experiment. So thank you for joining us for this. We hope you'll join us for subsequent events. So on to the subject of the session today. In the research we did for a working paper, which is in the chat, that informed the initial thinking around the UNESCO chair, we asked people working in universities across the world what the values base of the universities where they worked was. And the values base was often complex and contradictory, but in terms of a progressive value, almost all of them said that academic freedom was the most important value, both for them personally and for the university. And that this value had importance for them and for the university's work, but also in terms of the engagement of that university and its contribution to wider society, and particularly things like freedom of expression, thought, democracy, and so on. But it's clearly a very, very difficult moment globally in terms of academic freedom. Scholars at Risk this week published their Free to Think report, which makes pretty bleak reading, really, in terms of attacks on academic freedom and challenges the autonomy of institutions across the world in different regime types, from authoritarian governments right through to democracies. And it's perhaps not a coincidence that there have also been a number of normative developments really responding, I think, to this trend. The joint statement in support of academic freedom by around 70 countries at the UN Human Rights Council in March 2023 is one notable example. There have also been some regional statements in support of academic freedom, including in the Americas. But we are clearly at a quite perilous moment in terms of academic freedom, that shrinking civic and political space is being reflected in shrinking academic space. So this is the context in which we welcome Rosario Figari-Leos, who is our speaker today. Very warm welcome, Figaro. She's a postdoc researcher at the Chair of Peace Studies at the University of Gießen in Germany. And she also collaborates with the German-Colombian Peace Institute in Capaz in Colombia. Rosario has research interests in human rights protection and human rights defenders, gender-based violence, transitional justice, peace studies. There's quite a long list. And I'm also delighted to say that Rosario is on the advisory board for our UNESCO chair, and so has been supporting our work generally in a way that's been really invaluable. The title of her presentation today is Institutional Responses to Shrinking Academic Space in Latin America, the Ambiguous Role of Academic Institutions, and draws on a study that she's done in Brazil and Colombia. The format is that she will speak for around 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll open up for a Q&A. The way the webinar's organized, I'm afraid you won't be able to ask your questions in person, but please do start putting your questions in the chat while Rosario is speaking, and my colleague Pepe Cooper will pick those up at the end of the talk. So start firing your questions to Rosario as soon as you're ready, and we'll address as many of them as we can at the end of her talk. So Rosario, over to you, and many thanks again for joining us.
Now, Paul, thank you, and the chair, the UNESCO chair, for the invitation. It's a pleasure for me to have the chance to present some of the research findings here. I am going to share the screen. Let me see. Okay, can you see it? Let's change this here. Is okay like this? Yes, okay. So, well, I am going to tell you a bit more about this research project. The project took place in the framework of a fellowship program funded by the Mellon Foundation and the organization Scholars at Risk. And it started last year in 2022. And the project deals with the institutional reactions, or especially the reactions of academic institutions to attacks and harassment in the cases where their staff has been attacked or the target of different kind of threats or violence. For me, it was important to see what was the role of institutions, because always when we are talking about shrinking academic spaces, the first reference or the first responsibilities, of course, are by the state, which is the institution which is in charge of guaranteeing human rights and these kind of freedoms. But it was like a gap there. And I wanted to know what happened with these institutions, right? What the universities do in those cases. So just here to show you, here there's a picture I took during field work at the University of Antioquia in Colombia. And I thought that this sentence is a bit representative of the situation in the country and a bit of the history also. So in the picture, you can see what it says: in a country of lies, the truth is terrorist, right? And this kind of sentences is related to the construction of otherness and the stigmatization of those critical stakeholders, or, for example, the student movement, in those cases when they denounce or report or they express against specific policies or situations, right? So there's a tradition of stigmatization, of attacks on those actors that plays this kind of role. Now, when we go to the research itself, so in order to analyze this topic, I divided the research and also this presentation in two questions. The first one, what are the patterns and modalities and also function of violence against scholars in Brazil and in Colombia? And I have to say that I focus only on researchers and professors. I didn't focus on students because also it was a short research project, so we didn't have that much time, right? And I focus on, and the research also deals until the end of, in the case of Brazil, until the end of the government of Bolsonaro. So it's not related to the current government, because I think that's a difference also. And in the second part, so I wanted to know what had happened in those cases in which scholars at risk reported these attacks or aggressions to their own institutions. So what kind of reactions did they have in those cases, right? So for this, I had a qualitative research approach. I conducted fieldwork in Brazil and in Colombia. I conducted, in the case of Brazil, it's a bit different because the panorama also and the targets of attacks of scholars, even though there are many similarities, there are some differences also. So in the case of Brazil, I conducted 13 interviews, some of them in presence, others online, in the cities of Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, Brasilia, and Manaus. And the interviews were with scholars that were at risk at that moment, or that have been risk in the past, and also with some university authorities to know what was their perspective on the issue. In this case, also the scholars came from different disciplines, so social sciences, law, but also physicians and even medical sciences. Whereas in the case of Colombia, I did 10 interviews. One of them was a group interview, only in the cities of Bogota and Medellin, and also with scholars at risk and that suffer different kinds of persecutions, and also with university authorities. I have to admit that in these cases, most of the interviews belong from social sciences, education sciences, history, philosophy. There was not such a broad spectrum as in the case of Brazil. And in both cases, the most difficult thing to get was the interviews with authorities, right? So first I would like to say something, sorry, about the context. So whereas, I mean, there are, of course, very meaningful differences between the context of Colombia and Brazil, there are also several common aspects, especially regarding the modalities of attacks and also the impacts, right? Of course, in the case of Colombia, what we see is that violence take much more extreme forms, since Colombia is going through an internal armed conflict, and the university and the members of universities are cross and really affected by this violence. And of course, when they are researching or teaching in topics related to the conflict or to the causes of the conflict or the armed actors involved, they expose themselves to this kind of risk of being victims of extrajudicial persecutions, of being victims of enforced disappearances, displacement, really serious human rights violations. Now, in the case of Brazil, also what we've seen, especially in the last 10 years, when it's like this deterioration of democratic spaces, which also included the deterioration of the undermining of conditions for academic freedom, right? That also affected, for example, the erosion of autonomy, the autonomy of universities. Especially in the case of Brazil, we see many cases of criminalization and judicialization of those scholars who are critical or were to the government of Bolsonaro, for example. That was a very widespread practice in comparison to Colombia, where the attacks are more relating to physical violence and threats, right? Also, in the case of Brazil, the practices that were the most mentioned is the online harassment, the stigmatization in the press. It's also related to to a lot of, depending on the topics that scholars or professors are teaching. But I think that one aspect that was very common in both cases is also related to this public character or role that academics or professors can take, right? And I say this because it's not that everyone who is critical is automatically the target of attack. For example, in Brazil, some interviews said, well, but I am also critical and I didn't get any attack. Of course, if you are critical only in the classroom, but you don't have any visibility, the risk is much is lesser than in the cases where people, for example, or professors participate in public debates, write editorials, papers, or in television. So this higher visibility is one of the reasons also of risk, as well as there's an intersectional perspective. I mean, those who belong to marginalized groups, when they are more critical, when they expose and participate in demonstrations or protests, they have much more, and also if they belong to remote areas, rural areas of the country, and not to some elite private university, the risk they run is much higher than those living in the capital city or in urban centers. So that's what I want to see to make, because I think that also the impact of these attacks has also an intersectional impact, and affect people, not only affect them differently, but also the resources they have to deal with this violence is different, right? So in general, what we can see also that there's a shared thematic access, so between usually the causes defended by human rights defenders or environmental defenders, and also the topics which are focus of attacks by research on elections. For example, topics of gender in Brazil are especially attacks, these ideas of contradicting family values, but also topics of land grabbing. People who research on that can be also very targeted. The Amazon's environmental policies. In the case of Brazil, the topic of COVID was very relevant. That wasn't the case, for example, in Colombia, where the topics being more targeted are the ones related to, for example, illegal economies, paramilitary groups. So it depends, right, on the context. Now, there are some challenges that we find when we want to deal with this kind of problem or with this topic. Well, the first of them is to say that this is not new, right? The attack or the aggression or persecution of intellectuals, professors, researchers also happen in Latin America, or has taken place in Latin America for decades. So here, for example, I put it in Spanish because I didn't find it in English. But according to the Through Commission in Colombia, for example, during the armed conflict, more than 600 students have been killed, right, during the conflict. And we are not mentioning here professors or administrative staff. Also, that what we see perhaps are some changes in the modalities of attacks now and then, and in the actors involved. For example, now there's a really an increase in the use of the law, like on all these dynamics of criminalizations, and also of social networks. And also we see that in many cases, for example, in the government of Bolsonaro, it wasn't the government that was directly behind the attacks, but individuals of movements, particular movements, supporting the government, right? Also, what we see that in this kind of aggressions, in comparison to the cases of activists, there's like there's a huge. It's more difficult to talk about this, and people don't usually report it. I think that it's not clear why. In many cases, they don't feel academics tells that they are going, that can be something that important. They don't think they are in the front line. That's what many people said, for example, as in the case of activists. And also they think they could be stigmatized very fast, right? So the lack of report or the underreporting is also a problem to have data on this, and also to make the topic a topic of the public agenda, right, of the political agenda, in order to take measures. And well, finally, I think it's not possible. I'm trying to change it. Well, that universities also, in some point, reflect all the social polarization that we see in Latin America right now, where we see in many governments or in many societies movements of extreme right defending very traditional values and against the progression of other rights, for example, in the cases of gender, reproductive rights, and I think all these movements and tendencies are all present there. So in some point, the universities have become some space or battleground also in that direction. And we see that also, this kind of dynamics, when we see the reactions of universities and different faculties to deal with the attacks on academics. So now coming to the specific question, right? What happened in those cases? When I was wondering, when I was asking the interviews, so what did you do when you were like being targeted in the press, in the media, online? Many people who is under this condition, they don't even dare to leave their homes. So it's like they are isolating in their homes because they don't want it when the publicity or when the cases are very renowned. And it was interesting because and asking this in Brazil, for example, it's not the case in Colombia. There was a survey that not talking exactly about what universities do, but talking about the case of academic freedom. And they did a survey, a national survey, and as you can see, like at least more than 50% of the respondents, that was among universities, they say, or they affirm, they knew somebody who had to change the content of their classes, of their research, because of indications of their institution, because of fear. In many cases, like in between 32 and 35 and 42, respondents said that they have changed their class of their own classes and research because of fear of retaliation, because of fear of losing funding. So people feel fear when they are planning what they are going to teach, what they are going to research. And there was the question, so how had been the performance of the institution in that case? And as you can see, more than 40% confirm that it has been very poor. But the question is, what means poor? And here is where I come back to my research. And I could identify at least 3 kinds of main reactions, right? It doesn't mean that there's not another possibilities, but in most of the cases, even in very serious cases of physical aggression and threats, scholars says that there was no answer from their institutions, right? And these no answers was reflected in many kind of responses. So, for example, that in a specific content, that's common, right? If you are researching on land grabbing and you are living in an area where you have paramilitary groups who are the responsibles, of course you are going to be the object. So it's like part of the job. Or there was no interest at all. There was no response from authorities, not from the dean, not from the rector of the university. What the second kind of reaction in some cases, and I think people who had this at least was a bit lucky, is they have some kind of partial symbolic support, right? So that means that at least one of the inside university, one faculty, for example, wrote a public statement condemning the attacks or expressing the rejection of the actions that this person suffered, but not much more than that. So that's why, and also what many said, perhaps they have some kind of support from their colleagues in individual ways, but there was not really like an institutional backing, right, or support. Other factor influencing this kind of support was, or many said that it was very arbitrary. And in the sense that it depends a lot on the connections, personal or academic connection that you as scholar has with the authorities of the university, and under your role at university, your position in university. So it's not like there's a standardization procedure, but it depends very much in informality. And the third one, and I think one of the most serious, is this displacement of responsibility. So that when people, for example, was target of criminalizations dynamics in which, for example, they expressed, they wrote in a newspaper some critical about governmental issues, and then they got allegations at the judiciary. The university, what they did was actually to start internal investigations procedures, administrative procedures. In many cases, they suspended the person of his or her duties at the university and started themselves to know what happened. And in many cases, they started to investigate the person who was being the target of attack. So why are you researching on that? Why are you teaching those topics if you know that that's not very convenient in these times? So instead of treating the person as a victim, they started to treat this as a suspect. This kind of reactions in turn has consequences first at research and policy level, right? Because it translated in poor or not institutional responses at all, right? There's little documentation or also public debate. So the topic is silent. The reports, the announces that scholars did at the university, they have no relevance. They are not documented. And that also prevents or hinders the development of a preventive approach, a perspective, and also in the lack of data. So, and I think that's one of the main problems when we are dealing with scholars at risk in Latin America in comparison to other groups at risk, where we can see that there's disaggregated data per country, per region. That's not the case. So universities don't take and don't document the cases they have. Also, I'm going to we see that there are consequences, direct consequences for those affected, right? In the first case, what we see is a process or a dynamic of re-victimization and deepening and also enforcing already existing inequalities, reproducing these inequalities in the protection measures or in the lack of the protection measures, because people, when scholars at risk don't have any answer from their own institutions, right? Usually because of the work they are realizing there, what they feel isolated, they feel stigmatized, because if there's no answer, it's because probably they have done something wrong in order to be attacked. They have no support. They feel also isolated by others in their own job. In other cases, what happened is even when the university attempts or tries to take some measures, they have the impression that it's very interesting, especially in cases of Colombia, with a long story of violence and armed conflict, as if every case would be the first time, right? So it's this improvisation becomes like an institutional practice, and they start in every case from zero, right? In many cases, or in many no, in some cases, in the best cases, they were invited and they have some meetings, for example, with the legal department of the university, and sometimes they are even asked, what do you want us to do, with some limits, because they can do many things. And even though I think it's important that the person at risk has the chance to express what they want, what they need, in many cases, they don't have any idea what would be the best for them. So they would need also some advice and some support. So to have the experience of the institution in order, because they are already very vulnerable in that situation, and it's very difficult to know what the options are. They don't get this psychological support. They don't get also legal support in the sense that, for example, defending them or paying a lawyer to deal in cases of criminalization. And the third consequence is the individualization of security, right? So this means that the person, in most of the cases, since they don't get any support from their institutions, they have to use their own resources in all the sense, right? So, and financial resources to pay lawyers, to pay psychological support, also to, for example, to buy the security in their homes if they have to go or to leave the country. Now I'm finishing. They have also to use their own personal connections abroad if they have them. So here also we see all how inequalities have a role, because it's not the same those international scholars with a very who have an international career in comparison to those who don't have it. So the resources depends also on the social class that they have and the groups. So finally, or to finish, or some preliminary conclusions, I think that it's important to consider that academic institutions can also have a very important role in the prevention or in the support or redress of the damage caused by the attacks, but also could have them in the deepening of the damage, in the re-victimization, what is known as secondary victimization, also sometimes in the scholarship, what is the role of institutions dealing with violence. Also, they have a mediator role between the attacks, the person who is the target, and the state. So, because they could be also advocates and defend and promote security and a safe environment, or a culture of academic freedom, or the opposite. And in this sense, the paradox of this is that universities also have these multiplicity roles, because it's also true that big universities themselves are the targets of attacks, right? They have been victimized as institutions, especially in the case of public institutions, with cuts of budget, with also raids, when the police and the military get in the campus and attack the university and persecute authorities. But at the same time, in many cases, they can have a very passive role, or even a perpetrator role in some other serious cases. So to finish, and these are some also of the recommendations we have with my colleague Camila Nobrega included in a paper on Brazil that you can find in the website of Scholars at Risk. Some of the recommendations, there are more, that for universities, right? So that the topic of academic freedom should be a topic first, it should be part of the agenda. There should be part of research and promote it as such. There should be spaces to debate, right? What does it mean in a specific context? There should be a person, an office, in charge of advising, on providing protocols, in providing information, for example, even if the university doesn't have the resources, at least to provide information about networks, about organizations that could help people, for example, to leave the country in case they need it. And also, for example, create networks with other universities in Latin America, because in most of the cases, people have to leave to Europe or to the US, and that's also very difficult, in order to provide solidarity networks. Well, there are more, but just a few. And well, finally, thank you. These are some of the thoughts. And here's some sites that perhaps you think could be interesting, I can share later, and my contact for the future. So, Paul.
Thanks, Rosario.
Yes.
That was great. We've got a couple of questions in the Q&A, and Paul's got a question, and so have I. But maybe we'll start with the questions in the from the audience. So thank you, Anita, for the first question. I like this question. She asks, is there an international definition of scholar at risk? And interestingly, did you consider yourself a scholar at risk while you were studying this topic in Brazil and Colombia?
Should I answer every question, or?
Will we start with that one? Is there a definition, and did you consider yourself a scholar at risk?
Well, I don't know if there's such a definition. I mean, there's a definition of academic freedom and its relation with several rights, but I'm not sure if there's perhaps what is the concept of risk is more than the concept of scholar. I don't know what Paul thinks of that, but I don't know if like a real definition of scholar, because perhaps what is most discussed is the definition of a scholar, right? Because it changed. Who is considered a scholar at risk is also a problem, or it's at least a challenge when people have to ask for help, and when they have to attend or to ask for help to international organizations. I think because not everyone, even though if they are at the university or working, teaching, are considered a scholar, or don't have like the international requirements that a scholar has in specific spaces, right? So that's one of the problems also, who is considered a scholar. And then it depends also on the risk, because what some things could be considered a risk in some contexts are like minimized in others. Like, for example, in Brazil, even the other colleagues, right, they think that harassment in social networks is not enough to be considered a risk. Where in the cases where it really happens with dramatically frequent and very aggressive way, it can be a means of psychological drama, emotional stress, and can have serious even physical consequences. And well, I don't consider myself a scholar at risk. I mean, I have been in situations where we have a security incident, and not only during this research, only in other aspects. So in Mexico, but it were like isolated cases. It's very difficult to say, to be honest. It wasn't like like a frequent or like an state. That's something that happened repeatedly. It wasn't like that.
Okay, thanks, Rosario. And if anyone else has got any questions, do pop them in the Q&A or in the chat. But we'll go to Malena's question now. She says she's a student at the Law University of Buenos Aires, and she'd like to ask, what do you think, Rosario, are the causes or factors of the rise of ultra-right political parties that endanger our public education and are trying to eliminate equal access? And do you think there's a solution to these dangerous speeches, or what can be done to stop it?
Oh, that's a very
big question.
Yeah, that's a very difficult question. I think it's well, if she's from Argentina, I can imagine to what she's referring, because I am also very scared, I have to admit, because of the situation right now. But of course, that's the increase of this really extreme right wing movements, which could go to the government and which are actually already announcing all the rights they are going to curtail and eliminate, is a very meaningful risk for democracy, for the advance of rights. I ask also if that is even constitutional, when somebody openly shows that supports, for example, a military dictatorship, which were where massive human rights violations took place, and still this person is running for presidency, right? So I think there should be like some limitations, especially with basic standards that any candidate to presidency or a functionary or public servant should at least respect. And that's not the case in Argentina. But I think that also shows that there's other problems, there's social problems regarding exclusion and poverty that hasn't been addressed by current governments, because if not, we wouldn't have this kind of movement that would be so strong. So that means that there is a crisis of legitimacy of the current institutions also. And especially in Argentina, after this year, there's supposed to be 40 years of democracy, right? And we are about to lose it. So also, is perhaps we were expecting so much for democracy, and it didn't fulfill all the promises it should have. I don't know how you see it, but I think that's one of the problems also. It's not only this movement, but it's also the disappointment or the failure of public policies to include a lot of population, right?
Thanks, Rosario. Just before Paul's question, I just was interested. I know you mentioned that your research was about when Bolsonaro was in government in Brazil, but whether you had any thoughts on both the countries you studied have had regime change, and whether you think that's things will or already improving.
Well, I think it's the opposite. Now I think that the government of Lula, I mean, he had already in the past governments that they have, he had a much broader inclusive politics, allowing the access to education to many sectors of population which had been marginalized in the past. And I think he also has this promise of democratization of education and to enable the access and of several groups. Of course, that this is not a process that happened from one day to the other. And the other thing is, even though I think that there's no more, the Bolsonaro is not more in the government, that doesn't mean that the Bolsonarism is not even strong in Brazil right now. So all these movements, for example, also in basic education, not only at the university level, but in basic and middle education, secondary, advocating for education without, for example, sexual education, against gender studies. They are very present right now, and they are still part of a lot of harassment dynamics on those teachers trying to include those topics in the curricula, right? So it's not only a top-down dynamic that we see, but also there are still a lot of authoritarian tendencies in the society itself.
Thanks, Rosario. Paul, I know your question starts with these challenges, but I'm not quite sure which challenges, so I might hand over to you to put your question to Rosario.
I mean, I guess just generally whether issues around academic freedom, what can be said and what can't, and the implications from that, whether they are overwhelmingly in relation to kind of local national issues, or whether international issues sometimes create challenges. I'm thinking particularly of Israel-Palestine at the moment, and what kinds of things can be said, for example, in relation to support for Palestinians in Gaza, civilians in Gaza, and that kind of thing. Is that the kind of thing that also creates tensions on campuses and some of the kinds of reactions that you've described?
I think, yeah, all these political issues, also, for example, in the case of the Ukrainian and Russia war, I think also that it depends on the context. I think that the treatment of the topic is not the same probably in Germany than in the UK, right? Because of many historical aspects. But I think that it's also related, something that you mentioned at the beginning. So what is expected to be, or what is the role that the university should play in these cases, right? What is expected to be? Should the university be involved in this public debate, right? To have a critical role, to participate, to be a social actor? Or should the university, as other also scholars think, just to keep in a very objective research and teaching, not going out from the classrooms? So that's, I think, also part of the discussion, and also part of these scholars, or the research scholars, run, because in many cases, for example, the university didn't involve in the protection or in the support of scholars, because they consider that if a scholar was getting involved in a public debate, participating in a television show, for example, a political show, and if they were receiving allegations or defamation because of that, that's not the role of the university to protect them, because it wasn't in his or her role as university professor. You know, so that was also, so we don't have nothing to do, because that was something that he, for example, in the case in Brazil, he wrote in the newspaper. That wasn't part, or what he said wasn't part of his functions at the university. So in that way, the university also tried to, how do you say that, get away with the responsibility they have, and this role of supporting and being part of the public and engaging in the social reality that we are experiencing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thanks, Rosario. We've got a couple more questions now. There's one from Eric, who's got a question about the visibility of individual academics, and he's asking how far individual academics are able to control their visibility. If risk is related to choices about visibility, can attacks accentuate visibility and heighten risk? And so can academics find themselves losing control of their visibility? what, if anything, are they able to do about it?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of the risk is related to visibility. And one of the, I think, problems is that one of the consequences of that, or of the attempt of controlling visibility, is self-censorship, right? So what many scholars do after having, for example, such a great visibility after some kind of statement or research findings, and they experience all this harassment, all this visibility in a negative way, so people start to think twice before publishing specific things or teaching on specific topics, because they prefer, because even if they don't have, and especially because they don't have an institutional backup, right, or support, so they feel alone, and then they think, what do I gain with this? Just stigmatization. I could go to jail in many cases, right? They lost the funding for the research they are conducting. For example, in the case of Brazil, in the times of COVID, when the research findings weren't aligned with the government policy, so the result was the cut of budget for that research project, right? In the cases of vaccines, for example. So so you have to control visibility. How do you do it? And self-censorship is one of the main characteristics of consequence to protect yourself. I can also understand it, right? But it's also an undermining of research, of development, of the right to science, and that, I think, is also one of the consequences of this negligence of institutions not to be involved, and to have a more active role in protection and supporting.
Thanks, Rosario. There's another question from Anita, quite a practical question, like, considering the entire research cycle, how should researchers in non-Latin American universities like York mitigate against the risks of undertaking research in Latin America?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Sure. So considering the entire research cycle, how should researchers in non-Latin American universities like York, how should they mitigate against the risks of undertaking research in Latin America?
Well, I think that it would be very interesting and relevant to have more exchange, right? So that there should be more, because I know that in York and in other universities, you are taking also scholars and activists at risk. And I think that would be a practice that would be very useful in Latin America. Of course, this is also in some aspects a matter of resources, but it's not only about funding or resources. It's also about the political willing to establish a program, to establish connections. And I think in that way, because that's something that is now starting in Latin America, to see this as a problem, and then to say, okay, perhaps we have to have some protocols, standards, connections. How can we support people in these situations, right? But it's not something that still is very widespread. But I think it could be very important to have more dialogue spaces for that. So, Paul, you know, Latin America is waiting.
Right, Rosario, there's another question for you. Do you think the new Scholars at Risk regional initiatives will help address the data gap that you've identified?
If the Scholars at Risk organization would?
If their regional initiatives will help address the data gap that you identify?
Well, 2 years ago, actually, there was the Coalition for Academic Freedom in the Americas was created. That's a coalition of different actors, universities, the University of Ottawa, Scholars at Risk, the University of Monterey. But it's in a first stage. I think the coalition there. So I also am part of the coalition, and I think it's important to give more visibility to the coalition. One of the goals is also related to the enactment of the Latin or the American principles of academic freedom, which were enacted 2 years ago by the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights, also establishing the relevance and the obligations of states in the Americas to protect academic freedom. And I think that's one of the also of the goals of the coalition, to give more visibility and to advocate for these principles. But the problem is that it's not still very widespread, the universities, and it's not a topic everywhere. So I think that's why it's important to give more visibility through research, through the organization of conferences and different spaces to be able to talk, because I think that many scholars don't feel the freedom to tell that they have, for example, experienced harassment or other kind of threats in the framework of their work. And it's important to break this taboo, because if not, it's not going to be any measures to deal with this.
Okay, we've got a few minutes left if anyone wants to put one last question in the Q&A, but Rosario, I had one which might be outside of the scope of your research, and I think you mentioned some of the topics that increase the risk, and I think one of them you mentioned Indigenous rights. Do you know, what about Indigenous universities? Do they experience risk differently, or is there greater risk and threats in Indigenous universities?
I can imagine that depends on where they are and what the topics, but I could imagine that, yes, that's all population who belongs to these marginalized groups, especially when they are involved, for example, in practice of defending their rights to land, their rights to the territory. They could be at risk, but I don't want to say something that, because it's true, I didn't research that in particular, but it's true that, for example, in the cases of students, Indigenous students, they are in situation of higher vulnerability than as other students, for example, from the middle class in urban centers. They don't have the same resources and protection possibilities in many cases.
Okay, thank you. Well, if there aren't any more questions, thank you. Oh, hang on, we have got another question.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Rosario, because we at the center where I'm based, we I guess we set up 15 years ago and hosting human rights defenders at risk, and at that point there wasn't really a kind of research agenda around human rights defenders at risk. And over the last 15 years, I mean, considerably more people now are researching on various matters relating to human rights defenders, well-being, sustainability of activism, resilience, these kinds of topics. And I guess I just wondered whether you thought there might be a similar pattern here, that this is not a terribly well-researched topic at the moment, but that it might become one. And so that's the first question. And then I suppose whether the UNESCO chair could do anything to support that. I mean, would an early career event of academics, perhaps, who are working on this issue be helpful, be relevant, if we could bring in a range of other academics to kind of comment on papers or something like that? Is there something that our chair could do in this space, particularly around the research angle, that would be helpful?
Yeah, well, to the second question, I can already tell you that yes, I think so. But regarding the first question, the thing is that, and I think especially in Latin America, in many cases, the lines between activism and academics are not always so clear, So sometimes it's a label, it's a strategic labeling thing that activists or even academics do in order to get some support, because there are also not so many, not only research, but initiatives to support scholars, right? There are much more initiatives to support, and they are not also so many, right? But even scholars or activists or journalists, but not so many in the case of academics. And many academics are also activists in their field of research and the way they contribute. The problem is that in many contexts, it's not well seen, or is used as a tool of the legitimization of the results of research. And that has nothing to do with the methodology, with the procedures used to research, but only just because of the choose the election of the topic. That's why many scholars don't report, because they feel delegitimized as scholars, right? That's not the case of activists, that when you know that you have threats, it's because probably you were upsetting some relevant actors in powers, right? But in the cases of academics, they feel delegitimized, stigmatized, that they weren't like so serious because they are perhaps politicized or this kind of things. But I think it would be important to make it a topic, also to stress the role of academics in society and of their research in society, not as a way of delegitimizing them. I'm not sure if I answered your question because of that.
Yes, thank you.
And the second, yes, of course, I think that would be very important to give visibility, to create dialogue spaces, to organize some kind of events of early career, but perhaps also not only early careers. I would include scholars from different levels in a workshop, because it's not the same way, and I think that's also important to have an intersectional perspective on protection. It's not the same way that, for example, a scholar, I can imagine also with activists of 30 years old, threats in the early phases of their career, how they face threats and risk as a person of 60. That has other complexities also, and I think it's also important to have this point of view in many cases.
Thanks, Rosario. We have actually got 2 more questions, so maybe we've just got time for one. So I'll just ask this one from someone who hasn't asked one yet. So just briefly, were there any reflections in your interviews from those scholars who work closely with civil society or with marginalized communities? Sorry, to say that again. Were there any reflections in your interviews from those scholars who work closely with civil society or marginalized communities, activist academics, on the attacks they face? Do they face different forms of attacks? And do institutions respond in such cases more harshly or ignore them?
That's a very difficult question. Actually, I think that wasn't the criteria for the university to act more or less in the cases I interview, right? But of course, it has more to do with the position of that person within the institution and more than with the topics they were doing. Because even in cases where, let's say, very famous cases, when very well-renowned scholars, when you can think that they have more resources, they were also get alone with the problematic and even isolated. So, and I mean people with international prestige that you couldn't think, right? That, but in those cases, they didn't have also any answer or a very reduced support from their institutions. It's more related also to an institutional policy in many cases, right? Where the university doesn't want to be involved, especially in the cases where they depend of, for example, governmental support, right? In the cases of public institutions, sometimes the authorities don't have a very big margin to act, or that's also a problem with the university autonomy, where the government has the power to decide who are the authorities of the university, or at least partially. In governments as the one of Bolsonaro, that was a very delicate issue, right? So also that implies limitations for the performance and for the position of the university in cases of attacks.
Okay, thank you, Rosario. We're almost out of time, so thank you to everyone who's joined us, and thank you for your questions. And I put an email address in the chat for our next events are on human rights pedagogies in Asia and on student activism. So if you'd like to be on our mailing list to hear about those, there's an email address in the chat, and I will just hand over to Paul to close the event.
Well, just to reiterate Pippa's thanks. It's the first event. It's been an experiment. I think we've had a very lively discussion on what's a very topical issue. So My thanks for sharing those questions and comments, but particularly thanks to Rosario for being our first presenter. It was a really interesting topic. I've seen things you've written on this, and yeah, it's fascinating research, very topical, and I mean, sadly, is likely to be a growing issue going forward. So it's something that I think, as the UNESCO chair, we're likely to revisit in one form or another in the coming years. So many thanks to you all, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Paipa.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.